Hello students, welcome to this section of our presentation today. I'll be talking something about India's foreign policy, approaches to the study of India's foreign policy, and how has India's foreign policy been understood in terms of relations with states, with relations with international organizations, relations with the neighborhood, relations with the extended neighborhood, and with other global communities. Now, if we go by the standard of realism, or the main approaches to the study of India's foreign policy also goes through the idea of how foreign policy is fashioned, or what is foreign policy. To start with, if you try to analyze what is foreign policy, these are two terms that have been expressed here. The first is foreign and the other is policy, right? So, all of us know that there is economic policy, there is commerce policy, there is domestic policy, there is internal security policy, and policies which the government have varies in time and space throughout the government's mechanism of governance, right? So, foreign policy, I would say, is an specialized branch of international relations which is pursued by the people who manages the affairs of the state, especially the international affairs of individual states. So, according to me, what I view foreign policy as is that foreign policy is an extension of the domestic policy which helps states fashion its relations with the other states based on protection and promotion of its national interests. So, if you try to figure it out that what is foreign policy, then you must be noticing in the presentation that you are seeing that foreign policy is an extension of the domestic policy, right? So, foreign policy is not foreign, it's domestic policy. And what does that domestic policy do? That domestic policy, specialized part of that policy is that how states fashions its relation with the other states. For example, how does India figure in relation with Pakistan or Bangladesh or USA or maybe Myanmar, Nauru, whatever, right? You must have seen that in spite of the different interests that a state pursues, that a country pursues, the primary focus of every ruler, every king, every head of the state is how to promote its national interests, right? So, national interest needs to be defined, identified. Now, national interest is a very vague term, in trying to understand in terms of ideology, realism gives preference to national interest, but I'll come to realism part of it a bit later. Now, the second foreign policy trait is that it's geared towards protection of national sovereignty, defending borders, and promotion of economic interests of the country, right? So, foreign policy has a domestic audience. Foreign policy has a domestic orientation. And what does it do? It gives protection of its people by defending its borders, promoting economic interests of the country. So, you must have realized in recent years, in recent days, that despite of the political differences or military differences that one country has with any other country, we have not stopped our trade relations with that country, right? So, foreign policy is a specialized aspect of domestic policy. Now, coming back to the original title that we had started with, that what is the approaches, or how do we approach the study of foreign policy? There are various approaches to study foreign policy of India. In international relations theory, we always deal with different kinds of theories. So, we have realism, liberalism, constructivism, English school, Marxist school, critical theory. These are various ways of defining international relations And in context of foreign policy, this is how we see India's foreign policy with other states, or any state's foreign policy with other states, right? So realism, if we take, for example, the realist aspect, what does realism do? The centrality of realism is on the power, right? The brute power of the state. Realism can be both in terms of power, in terms of national interest, but the extreme focus of India's foreign policy is towards the power. I mean, the relationship that we have with other countries is based on the power aspect of international relations and foreign policy. Now, if we approach India's foreign policy post 1947, we will see that most of the foreign policies that India has pursued, if you start from the Nehruvian era down to the present UPA government, you will see that realism has been the base or the core idea of foreign policy. What does realism talk about? Realism talk about, as I said, the centrality of power in its relations with the other states. So, power becomes the watchword or the word of caution in international relations and foreign policy. Now, if we see the evolution of foreign policy of India, we have seen that throughout Indian history, post-independent Indian history, you see that there has been a shift from the foreign policy that was being pursued by the British East India Company then to the direct British rule in India. They did not pursue foreign policy because we were imperial subjects. India was under imperialism or colonialism of the British rule. So foreign policy, whatever was pursued, was not pursued by the state of India or by the country of India, but by the Britishers. That's why we did not had an independent foreign policy. Independent foreign policy of India started only after India becoming independent in 1947. What were the main drivers of foreign policy of India post 1947? In foreign policy of India, we understand that there was something called Nehruvian consensus. Now, what is Nehruvian consensus? Nehruvian consensus, Jawaharlal Nehru, all of us know, the first Prime Minister of India, was a scholar of history, was scholar of international relations, was scholar of, actual going-ons at the level of world politics, right? So, he was well-read person. He had made personal friends with many leaders of the world, and one of the Nehruvian consensus that was there from say 1947 to the early 70s was to promote India's economic interest through consensus, through bringing in people and states which believe in the idea of diplomacy and stopped short of fighting a war, right? So, muscular foreign policy was not there in Nehruvian consensus, right? So, the emphasis was on coming together of those states in the post-independent world, especially the post-colonized states, newly independent countries which had come out of the imperialist yoke after generations, right? So, the consensus revolved around bringing those states together under one platform, under one consensus to describe the ongoing that is happening in the world at the global level and what impact it will have on the domestic politics or at the domestic level. So, Nehruvian consensus in the immediate aftermath of independence especially talked about building diplomatic relations, building consensus over broader issues, bringing new international economic order, having specialized international relations in the sense where the lesser known people of the world, especially those people from the post-imperial states, would be coming together. Non-aligned movement, or NAM as we know, was the most important manifestation of that Nehruvian consensus. So starting with Nehru, non-aligned movement was what Nehru stood for, that we should not be joining the power blocks. The immediate power blocks that were there, which existed during the Cold War period, the newly independent countries would come under a banner in which they will be in a position to bargain their relative economic prosperity from both the blocks. That was the idea of non-aligned movement. Without joining power blocks, without joining an agenda which was pursued by Nehru and many others, right? So the Nehruvian idea was to develop a consensus on matters concerning the broader world, especially the post-colonized countries, right? Post-70s, there was shift from this Nehruvian consensus with coming of Indira Gandhi in power, Congress party in power, post Nehru Congress party in power. It moved away broadly from Nehruvian consensus of diplomacy as the hallmark or the benchmark of Nehruvian consensus to a more muscular policy of having an aggressive foreign policy, in the sense that the disputes which were not settled by the diplomacy would now be settled by more muscular approach through use of force. India fought 3 consecutive wars, major wars, from 1962 to 1971, right? So we had the 1962 Sino-Indian War, then we had 1965 war with Pakistan, again 1971 war with Pakistan, which resulted in the dismemberment of Pakistan, right? So we moved from a more diplomatic kind of consensus, Nehruvian consensus, to more muscular and a proactive orientation in the world affairs. Indira Gandhi also undertook what is known in international relations terminology or foreign policy terminology as the peaceful nuclear explosions of 1974. This was manifestation of the more muscular form of foreign policy that India started pursuing post 70s, and it has gone on till date, right? So we have been trying to project our power, largely political power, largely international political power and military power in many ways, which would make India an important player in the world, not only the third world, not only among the non-aligned movement countries, but independent identity of India as a powerful state. I mean, post 70s politics has moved away from the Nehruvian consensus. Now, what has been the basis of this consensus of Nehruvian policy? The Nehruvian consensus has moved from trying to understand how things have shaped up, or what is that is becoming the basis of India's foreign policy approach. How is Indian foreign policy shaping up post 1970s, and who are the determinant factors of making of the India's foreign policy? For example, the foreign policy making part, right? Who makes the foreign policy? Who are those people who actually make the foreign policy, or who are the people who actually determine what foreign policy should be, or what foreign policy should like to be? I mean, ideally, who are the people who are making the foreign policy? Throughout history, foreign policy making has always been an elite project, right? And elite, when I say elite, is not people who have ascriptive statuses, who are born with, elite status, but, foreign policy is a very specialized activity. So, foreign policy making has always been an elite project, and similar has been the case of India. If you see the manifesto of the political parties, you will see that political party manifestos show foreign policy as probably the last item in their manifesto. I was going through one of the major political parties' manifesto, in which the foreign policy making or foreign policy orientation of that party was 25th in terms of point wise. In terms of, out of 25 major manifesto issues that a political party had, political parties are giving less importance to, foreign policy making or foreign policy in their agenda or in their manifestos. In India, there are certain identifiable groups of people who are responsible for determining the course of Indian foreign policy. And who are these people? Who are these people who describe or make the foreign policy agenda or foreign policy narrative? There are 6 identifiable groups here. The first, which I have categorized, are the people whom I have summed up as the strategic community. And strategic community, mind you, is a very large term. It involves whole lot of people, including the army officers or people related with army, with the military, air force, and these are people who determine what the principle of the state should be, right? I have termed this as strategic community, and these are not only people from the army background. These are university professors. These are people who have an idea of how these are arms dealers at times, who also determine what foreign policy orientation that a state should take. I mean, these are kind of pressure groups which operate at the level of government to determine the foreign policy orientation. Then there are career diplomats, the diplomats who are specially made to or trained to become diplomats to pursue diplomacy at the level of state or at the level of at international level, right? So diplomats are those people who are career diplomats, who have been trained to be diplomats, given those privileges which otherwise is not available to non-diplomats. Then there are foreign service officials. Foreign service is a permanent career-oriented diplomacy. And if you contrast the diplomats with foreign service officials, diplomats are those people who are actually trying to understand what India's foreign policy orientation should be, and not all diplomats are foreign service officials. Remember that, The foreign minister of India is a diplomat. I mean, ideally he is a political appointee, a political representative who joins the corps of the diplomats as a foreign minister, right? So, foreign service officials are career professionals who join in as maybe as Indian foreign service officers, or maybe as an ambassador, who are not always from the Indian foreign service cadres. So the other is the bureaucracy. As I told you in the previous presentation, in the previous slides, that bureaucracy actually deals with domestic policy affairs, right? Now, foreign policy is that aspect of domestic policy which is played largely in the context of economic interests as I told you, in terms of promoting India's interests, promoting India's security, protecting India's borders. Bureaucracy determines what foreign policy should be, right? So, in many ways, bureaucracy tries to determine how things will be actually shaping up in giving an orientation to the foreign policy narrative of the state or of the countries. Then there are business leaders. Post 1990s, with coming of Narasimha Rao in power, and with the economic liberalization process that started, there was an immediate requirement of the people to come together, to organize themselves under various institutions, for example, FICCI, PhD, CCI, things like that. These were business leaders who tried to influence India's foreign policy in a positive way, because the borders had opened up in economic terms. The trade or export import that was going on at a broader level, at a wider level, they wanted to determine the economic policy so that export oriented economy develops, right? So, these were the people who were influencing policy decisions, especially in foreign policy. For example, how would naphtha be imported, or how would state take up the question of import of advanced electrical goods, right? Whether they will be making it in India, or if they are buying it from the Western world or developed world, what would be the nature of India's relationship with, say, France when it comes to purchase of nuclear reactors and things like that. So business leaders were an influencer in foreign policy making. Lastly, but not the least, the political parties. Political parties actually address the concerns of their constituents, and their constituents have certain expectations with the political party, whether they are in opposition or as a ruling formation, that what would they gain out of foreign policy in their terms, in their principled terms. So, in many ways, the foreign policy making has always been an elite exercise, has always been an exercise which involved very few, very selected, which were not mass leaders, or which were not people who had large ideological orientation, but were definitely confined to a limited activity, that of making foreign policy decisions and influencing those decisions. Now, how has India's foreign policy matrix panned out in, say, from 1947 down to 2021, or what has been the foreign policy matrix, which I have called them? India, I have tried to divide India's foreign policy in three matrix. The first is at the global level, the second is at the regional level, and the third and the final is in the immediate neighborhood. And how has the approaches to study of foreign policy tried to understand the foreign policy matrix in realist terms, right? Now, what does India intend to do? What does India want to do at the global level? Now, to suit India's foreign policy interest, India would like the world to be a multipolar world, right? So, that multipolar world would be actually a world in which there will be more than one pole or more than two poles, as there was during the Cold War. There would be cooperation with Russia and China. I mean, now the Chinese thing has taken a back seat, but at the institutional level, at BRICS, SCO and RIC level, there will be cooperation. There India's claim to permanent membership of the Security Council is one of the major metrics of India's foreign policy objective. Then strengthening the conventional military and maintaining nuclear deterrence is one of the metrics at the global level, right? So, what is India trying to look in this matrix is that how things would be at the global level in terms of foreign policy. At the regional level or the South Asia and the Indo-Pacific level, India would like to have a closer cooperation with ASEAN, with West Asia, with Africa, and to counter the China-Pakistan nexus in the larger Belt and Road Initiative. And of late, what India has been trying to do is to assert the naval supremacy at the Indo-Pacific level. And in the immediate neighborhood, it would be to establish the benign hegemony in South Asia, managing China-Pakistan nexus, and strengthening SAARC. These are at the immediate neighborhood level. To sum up, finally, in another 1 minute, the evolution of India's foreign policy has been a reflection of various currents of ideological strands that has been prevalent, various ways through which foreign policy can be theoretically approached, and various metrics of India's foreign policy analysis can be done. Thank you all.